Welcome to Stories from the NNI. I'm Lisa Friedersdorf, Director of the National Nanotechnology Coordination Office. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Jeff Blackburn, a senior scientist and group manager at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Thanks so much for joining us today. To get us started, can you tell us how you first got involved in nanotechnology?
Sure, yeah, and thanks for having me on the program, Lisa. I really appreciate it. Really started off in high school where I had some really awesome science teachers, and I also had a really amazing English teacher, which might not sound like it relates to science as much, but actually my job is mostly writing these days, so it's actually been hugely influential. And then I went to Wake Forest University for my undergraduate. I had some really awesome professors there, like Dr. King and Dr. Mandeville and Dr. Kondapudi. Dr. Kondapudi in particular got me really interested in climate change and sustainable energy technologies and all these different things that really got me interested into going into a career in science. And so I actually applied to go to CU Boulder for graduate school. And I was originally attracted to their atmospheric chemistry program. And so I really wanted to study atmospheric chemistry, which I still think is a super important topic. But I took a class with this awesome professor named Dr. Art Nozick, who was teaching a class on renewable energy. And he had this class where he had a bunch of guest lecturers that came from the National Renewable Energy Lab, which was right down the road here in Golden. And each one of them taught one or two guest lectures on their particular field of renewable energy. And that got me incredibly interested. And towards the end of that class, Art said, I've really enjoyed chatting with you over the course of the semester. Would you be interested in being a graduate student in my group? And I said, well, yeah, that sounds fantastic. And so that really got me into his group. And in that group, I was studying things like semiconductor nanocrystals and using those for making more efficient solar cells. And so that's what really got me kind of set off into nanoscience from day one in graduate school, and then was doing most of my research, luckily, at the National Renewable Energy Lab, because he was a joint professor at CU and worked at the National Renewable Energy Lab. So did that for my graduate research, and then was able to do a postdoc with another really amazing scientist named Mike Heben, who was doing a totally different type of research on hydrogen fuel cell vehicles and how to store hydrogen in different types of nanomaterials. And so that kind of steered me in a totally different direction and a different field, which was super fun. And I've kind of followed on from that as a staff scientist here at NREL in a bunch of different fields that all try to use nanomaterials and nanotechnology to come up with interesting solutions for different types of renewable energy applications.
So you mentioned sustainable energy technologies, and you gave a couple of examples. You talked about semiconductor nanocrystals and solar cells and using nanotechnology in hydrogen fuel cells, and I assume for some of the storage technologies. Can you talk about the research that your group is doing now in sustainable energy technologies?
We kind of have a broad palette of things that we work with. We try to synthesize a lot of interesting nanomaterials in our group, in our lab. Across my career so far, we've tried to synthesize interesting single-wall carbon nanotubes, two-dimensional semiconductors and metals like graphene and transition metal dichalcogenides. Those are kind of like graphene, but they're semiconductors instead of metals. And most recently, we've gotten into these perovskite semiconductors, which is a class of semiconductors, which is really interesting. It's kind of a hybrid between inorganic and organic semiconductors, and you have a lot of cool flexibility with the way you make these hybrid materials, and you can make them in all kinds of different dimensions, from one-dimensional to zero-dimensional to two-dimensional. And so a lot of our research is basic science. So we do a lot of spectroscopy studies, structural studies, all different kinds of studies to really understand the fundamental cool things that you can do at the nanoscale and why those might be interesting for renewable energy technologies. And so we do the fundamental science, and then we try to translate that into proof of concept devices where we make things like thermoelectric energy harvesters, solar cells that incorporate nanoscale materials, batteries that incorporate nanoscale materials, like you mentioned, hydrogen storage media that incorporate nanomaterials to soak up a lot more gases and things like that. And then most recently, I guess we've gotten into the field of energy efficient computing and trying to make materials that can make for more energy efficient computing and information processing and things like that.
So you mentioned thermoelectric energy generators. Can you describe a little bit how they work?
Sure. Yeah. Thermoelectric energy generators basically try to take heat from the environment, and that can be from a lot of different sources. It can be from a tailpipe that's really hot on a vehicle, it can be from pipes that are conducting hot water through your house or through an industrial building, or it can be even from your own body. It tries to take that heat and generate electricity out of it. And so you need materials in that case that can conduct electricity really well, and they have to have what's called a high thermopower, which means that when you apply temperature difference to them, they convert that temperature difference to a voltage. And so that's how you get good current and voltage from these things. And you can use these thermoelectric energy harvesters to do all kinds of things and power, small devices, wearable devices, power sensors that might be out in remote areas and you don't want to change batteries that often and so on. So that's one of the areas that we've researched quite a bit with single-walled carbon nanotubes in particular. We've found ways to make special types of carbon nanotubes and make them highly pure and semiconducting so that they make much better thermoelectric energy harvesters.
Does your group work across disciplines? I mean, what is the makeup of your research group at NREL?
Yeah, we definitely work across disciplines and not only within the group, and we have chemists and physicists and material scientists and even engineers in our group at any given time, but we also work across disciplines by just collaborating with other folks at NREL or other folks outside of NREL. So to me, that's really the only way to do research these days is to collaborate with as many, smart people that have different aspects that they focus on to try to tackle these big problems. And so we have a lot of projects where we are doing things like collaborating with folks in our biological department, where we've made some interesting devices that actually couple nanomaterial-based electrodes to living bacteria, for example. And they can deliver electrons to these living bacteria and use those electrons, the bacteria use those electrons to convert carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into usable chemicals and fuels. And so that has a material science aspect to it. It has a biological aspect to it because the biologists are trying to engineer those organisms to behave the way they do. It has electrical engineering components to it and all kinds of different things. And so really the only way we come up with all these really cool technologies is to collaborate across disciplines and to utilize experts for a lot of different fields. And even when you're just studying the nanomaterials themselves and how they might be interesting, you really have to have a bunch of different types of experts that look at the nanomaterials. You have to have spectroscopists, you have to have microscopists, you have to have surface scientists, experts in solving structures to really understand what structures the nanoparticles are in and all these types of things. So to us, it's a very important thing to collaborate across disciplines, both within NREL, within the group, and outside. So we collaborate a lot with external institutions as well.
So the example that you provided of bacteria that help convert carbon dioxide into a usable fuel of some sort, is that a mechanism to help combat climate change?
Potentially, yeah. So there is a big push at NREL and at other institutions to, we call it at NREL, we call it electrons to molecules. And that's basically how can you take electricity and then use it to make a bunch of different types of molecules that might be useful for society. And those molecules can be fuels for vehicles, or they can be chemical precursors that can go into the chemical industry. It can be making ammonia from nitrogen. Some of the advances that have been made in things like solar cells and wind power make it so that renewable electrons can be quite cheap these days, but you produce a lot of them at one given time. And sometimes when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, you want to be able to do something with those electrons. So one of those solutions is to use the electrons to produce those types of molecules and store that energy, that electrical energy in chemical energy. And so, yeah, that's one of the things that got us into this is like, can you take those electrons and turn a climate forcing gas like CO2 into something else? So you're killing two birds with one stone, right? You're taking some CO2 out of the atmosphere and you're also making useful molecules out of it.
As a nanoscientist, I have a two-part question for you, and that is looking back over the past 10, 15, 20 years, Where do you feel that nanotechnology has made the most progress? And looking forward, the next 10, 15, 20 years out into the future, where do you see the big opportunities where nanotechnology will make a difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, from a very personal kind of technology standpoint, I started my career in 2000 in graduate school, 1999 really, but looking at semiconductor nanocrystals, and it was a relatively young field at that point, but people were making great progress in it. And to see now that, you can go to your local electronics store and get a television that has quantum dots in the television and these beautiful LCD televisions with, these amazing colors. That's been a pretty cool thing to see. Just one technology that I was involved in a little earlier in my career evolved to where it's now in this really cool commercial technology. In terms of other areas that have grown a lot, I think I've been really amazed at the advances that folks have made in microscopy and imaging. People are using things like scanning tunneling microscopy and transmission electron microscopy to see features at the atomic scale that you just couldn't see a few decades ago. And it's mind-boggling. And with TEM especially, I've seen a couple of really cool talks recently where people are using these graphene encapsulation liquid cells, where you take two pieces of graphene and you can put liquid in between it, and then you can image through the planes of the graphene. And you can see in real time things like chemical reactions happening at the molecular and atomic scale, and phase transitions and proteins moving around. And watching those types of movies is just fascinating. And that's been a really cool thing to see advances in. For the future, it's always hard to predict, but I definitely have my eye on a few different fields. I think that one area that nanotechnology can make a big impact on in the future is energy efficient computing. That includes, making better digital transistors. There are a bunch of great researchers making advances on, how you can make digital transistors out of nanomaterials like single wall carbon nanotubes or transition metal dichalcogenides, and make the channel widths, incredibly, incredibly small. So going down to the 10 nanometer type scale. And I think there'll be some big advances in that area. You can also incorporate nanomaterials into applications like neuromorphic computing and quantum computing, where everything in those fields is really based around harnessing properties and processes at the nanoscale. For quantum computing, it's you're really trying to harness these cool quantum confined properties that change the interactions between charges and spins and vibrations and things like that. So nanomaterials are just perfect for those types of applications. And then in neuromorphic computing, you're trying to basically make very small devices, pack them together super tightly, and have them respond to really tiny electrical stimuli and things like that. And again, nanomaterials are just perfect for that kind of thing. A couple of other areas, I guess, would be sensors, in my opinion. Like, I think that since nanomaterials have such a high surface area to volume ratio, they just respond to changes in their environment really sensitively. They're great little sensors, and those changes in the environment can be temperature or light or all kinds of electromagnetic radiation. And so there's, I think, a big opportunity for incorporating nanomaterials into cool sensors that are going to define how we interact with the world via all kinds of different wearable technologies, self-driving vehicles, sensors that can be out in remote outposts, and all these kinds of cool things that we'll see in the future. The last one that's not really my field, but I think they'll play a big role, is medicine. So I think nanomaterials will make pretty big impacts in things like biological imaging, drug delivery, and a whole host of other applications there. Not necessarily my field, but I like following those advances when I can.
So those are great examples. And I think those are all examples that can get students excited about nanoscience. So do you work with students? Do you have students in your lab? And then what advice would you give them?
Yeah, absolutely. No, we work with a lot of postdocs in the research group, and we work with students as well that work with us through the local universities like CU Boulder, like I did when I was a graduate student, and Colorado School of Mines, which is really close by as well. And so I think those interactions are super important, and I really love working with students. And we've also had some opportunities to work with younger students, like high school students, and I'm currently doing that right now with a really cool program that is based out of a New York high school where they try to do an independent research project with a professor or scientist from an institution that they can interact with. So I think that's really fun. I guess some of the advice I would give for students, one is I think we need as diverse of a group of students and postdocs and future scientists as absolutely possible. We all have our own unique backgrounds and history, and that impacts how we think about problems and how we approach really complex problems and how we interact with other people. And that's all part of the scientific process. And so I think when you can stack your deck and fill your institution with as many diverse types of scientists as possible, you really get the best outcomes, because you're not just diversifying your institution along having the right technical skills, you're also diversifying along having all the different right types of soft skills that define, how you communicate with others and how you communicate your science and how you interact with others to tackle these big problems. So that would be one of my biggest pieces of advice is just for us to really encourage as many different types of diverse scientists to get into this as possible. And I guess one other piece that I always like to mention is that I think when you're young and you're first getting into science, there's this notion that scientists who have just published a paper or who've been, in a field for a long time, they have all the answers and they've solved those problems for good, and they're just moving on to the next problem. And the longer you stay in research, I think the more you find that you just have many more questions than answers, many more questions than answers. And so I like to encourage students to kind of push past those feelings of imposter syndrome, right? That can be really debilitating. And it's just this feeling that you're surrounded by this community of scientists who know everything and know so much more than you. And, how can you be in this field with them if you don't know as much as they do? And it can really steer some students out of science. And I think that's a really tough thing that almost everybody has gone through. So I guess I would encourage young students and early career scientists that if they're having those types of feelings, just talk with other folks about them. And I think 9 times out of 10, you'll find that everybody else has gone through those exact same feelings at some point in time, and you can get past those, and you really have what it takes to contribute to science. Recognizing that there are so many questions out there and that you're going to be constantly asking those questions for the rest of your career is a really important thing to convey to students.
Well, thank you so much for that advice to students and for talking with us today. Do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Sure. I think that it is an awesome time to be in science and nanotechnology in general. And there's a ton of great problems that you can get involved in and think about how you provide understanding and technological solutions for these types of problems. There's problems in how we use energy and consume energy and how that connects to our finite resources. There's global climate change that affects those resources and our biosystems and everybody's standards of living. And there's finding intelligent ways to close the loop, I guess, on all these products and materials that we like to use, because a lot of times with technological solutions comes more waste, and there's a lot of scientific development that needs to be undertaken to understand how to make things more circular, right? So the products and materials that we make, they don't just get used and consumed and then thrown away and then turned into waste. They get recycled, reused into new and better products. So I think those types of problems are going to be here for the long haul, and we need really intelligent and creative people to go into those fields.